Next is finding new ways to learn for students of all ages. Next is making sure those who need COVID tests get them. With ASU Innovation, it's time to look forward to what's next.
The human brain is the most complicated object in the known universe. It's more complicated than the working of a star. It's more complicated than solar systems. It's more complicated than the objects in galaxies.
I have a dream.
I can't imagine that nature, whatever you believe, nature or the creator, put that thing between your two ears so that you would use some tiny percentage of it. I can't believe that that's the case. The notion of education being for a few people, that's absurd. That is literally absurd. Our why, our reason for existence, is to construct the public university which is serving the success of the democracy, the success of the people and their families directly, with intent, with purpose, with differentiation, with responsibility, with measurement, with creativity, with all the things that we can bring to bear. That's what this is about.
If you think about the audaciousness of that an institution says it's going to take fundamental responsibility for society, for someone like me, I want to be part of that.
Every single one of us is a one-of-a-kind. We exist on Earth for this brief period of time, and that one unique opportunity that you have cannot be wasted. It needs to be maximized to its fullest extent.
What does it mean for us to be able to say, we have something for you, specifically for you and for the 6 other people in your small town? I think that's one of the things that gets missed, is the fact that we can reach 10 million people or we can reach 10 people. And all of them get the same kind of engagement from us and the same kinds of commitments to say, we want to help you create a future of your own making.
Access and excellence. We need to give access. We need to create inclusive communities, but it's because that's going to make us all more excellent in our sciences and in our ability to use our scientific knowledge to solve grand challenges.
The dual pursuit of access and excellence is not just operationally expedient, it's not just economically expedient, it's not just fiscally expedient, it's morally expedient. It's the path to a meaningful social progress for this country and for the world.
To take an institution and reorient it to a social impact is something that is what universities should be about, but we've forgotten about.
I think we're at a time where higher ed has to transform. We have to. We can't keep going with our old ways. And I think that ASU is incredibly well positioned to make that change as we lean into the future.
We have to take on responsibility. So this notion of taking on responsibility is really, really important.
We have to change the world now. We have to change it now. We cannot wait. And ASU is the place that says, you have to change it now. What do you need to take it to the next level?
It is important that we have models. It is important that young people look and say, oh, I belong there. So that gives me great joy and the responsibility of knowing that it's my shoulders they're going to stand on. I often tell them, I'm just holding the space for you. I am holding the space for you. And when you're ready, I'll be ready to go.
I felt like I was bringing my personality and my value to this school, and I felt like I was a part of something that was going to be really big.
My voice has been something that I have discovered within the years, and it's something that I will forever be grateful.
What you can achieve here is limited only by your imagination.
It's a really unique situation to be here at ASU. It's like being in the front seat of the educational revolution.
What we learn here has a potential to influence the entire globe and humans living everywhere.
What would make me happiest would be that the cultural changes are so dramatic that the institution continues to design and redesign and morph its design going forward and becomes this truly adaptive institution, really working on social outcomes rather than working on individual university or individual faculty outcomes. What drives me is this notion of the individual human and the individual human mind being able to become this powerful force. You know, we've dreamt about this in art and literature and culture for thousands of years, and we're just now to the point where I'm 100% convinced that we can make it happen.
Greetings from Tempe. My name's Brian Brayboy, and I'm a member of the Lumbee tribe and director of the Center for Indian Education. I want to welcome you to our webinar series. I'm really thrilled with what the team has put together over the coming months as we begin to do this. So let me tell you how we got here. A few years ago, we started planning the 60th anniversary for our center. And as we emerge into our 61st and then our 62nd year, in the midst of planning for this, we had a global health pandemic that exposed many other things along with it as well, which really forced us to rethink what we wanted to do. And while we wanted to gather in person, it did not seem the prudent thing for us to do. But we also didn't want to miss a Diamond Jubilee. How many research centers actually celebrate a 60th anniversary? So we decided we were going to do this series of webinars and conversations that are really focused both on the past, the present, and the future of Indigenous education. And so that's how we ended up here. I'm really glad that you have decided to join us for one or all of these. They're going to be exciting and interesting, and I know that the team has put a lot of thought into them. Let me back up again. I'm coming to you from Tempe, which sits on the ancestral homelands of the Acamel O'odham and Peepush peoples. There were certainly other communities, other tribal communities and peoples who utilized the space because of the verdant river that was really flowing through here, that flowed all the way to the Sea of Cortez. So we're coming to you from that and recognize that with this recognition, there's a certain level of responsibility that the institution has to those peoples. And in some ways, that's where the Center for Indian Education comes in. We were founded in 1959 at the time to really try to meet the educational, cultural, and social needs of tribal communities and children. And to be perfectly honest with you, 61 years later, that's precisely what we intend to do. Our scope is widened. We serve the 22 tribal nations and communities in what is now the state of Arizona, but we have partnerships across the U.S., and we've got partnerships in Canada and in New Zealand and Australia and other places that are emerging. So we have gone global in some ways, but really our heart is in Arizona and in the U.S. in terms of the work that we do. We continue to want to serve the educational, social, and cultural needs of tribal communities. Importantly, our job is to work with those communities to create futures of their own making. We don't determine what those futures are. What we have is a particular capacity to be able to do research, to write policy, to think about other kinds of work, and we bring those assets to communities in service to them. It is one of the unique hallmarks of our center that has been around for 61 years. We host the Journal of American Indian Education, which is now it's about to enter into its 60th volume year, which is a pretty remarkable thing. We set policy, we write policy papers for different organizations, some affiliated with tribal governments, some with the federal government in the U.S., others for private foundations, and others for scientific organizations. We train students, we prepare Indigenous students to go out and create a future of their own making, but many of them are focused on also making meaning and making futures for their own tribal nations. That's a really important piece of what we do. And as I said, we publish the journal. So we are focused on research, policy, and publication, and remain doing that, and really hope that we will do that for the next 60 years as well. I've had the pleasure of being the director of the center, co-director or director of the center since 2009, and we'll look forward to transitioning at some point in the near future. Without any further ado, I want to thank our sponsor, the Spencer Foundation, for their generous support being able to do this work. And I'm really just so excited about the work that and the webinars that you will be engaging in. So welcome take care of yourself, and looking forward to when we can gather again in person. Take care. Hey, it's Brian Brayboy. I'm really pleased to be able to introduce to you Dr. Colin Ben. Dr. Ben is the Assistant Director of the Center for Indian Education. Previous to that, he had been a postdoctoral fellow at the center. Before coming to Arizona State, he completed his PhD at the University of Utah, where he served as the Assistant Dean for Diversity in the Graduate School there. He's got lots of honors, including being an ambassador for American Indians with Opportunity and being a Native American 40 under 40 at the National Center for American Indian Enterprise Development. I think what I really appreciate about Dr. Ben is he is committed to Navajo peoples and the Navajo Nation, to Indigenous people more broadly defined. His work has been really important in terms of helping us think about graduate students, Native graduate students, and in particular Navajo graduate students, which is what his dissertation focused on and what his follow-up publications have done. He's really asked us to think about, well, what does it mean for Native doctoral students and graduate students to be able to be successful, to be committed to who they are as peoples, and to be able to give back to their communities. It's really terrific work. I'm thrilled that he is with the center now. He is guiding us on a really nice path, and I'm thrilled that he's the one who's facilitating the conversation today. So welcome, Dr. Ben, and I hope you'll join me in saying hello to him.
And for your mentorship. For the past 5 years, I've been at Arizona State University. Your leadership in directing the Center for Indian Education, the Journal of American Indian Education, and publishing countless scholarship together all have positively impacted Indigenous education and educators all over the world. The mission of the Center for Indian Education, also known as CIE, is to serve as a research and resource center in the field of American Indian, Alaska Native, and Indigenous education at the local, state, tribal, national, and international levels. And I'm grateful that I have the opportunity to learn from you as we move CIE projects forward. And thank you for the guidance in making the celebration of our 60th year of Indigenous Excellence a virtual reality. Welcome, everyone. I'm pleased that you have joined us for our 5th and final webinar celebrating 60 years of Indigenous Excellence at the Center. I'm excited to be your moderator today. Please allow me to introduce myself in my Navajo language. Yate shke do shidine she tapahan nishle do tachini bashichin torachini dashiche aro ashihin dashinale she colon ben dashijine she tabata de nashak ade hosdote shagan. For those of you who are non-Navajo, I'll now translate what I said into English. I said, hello, my relatives. I am of the Water's Edge clan, born for the red running into the water people. My maternal grandfather is of the Bitterwater clan, and my paternal grandfather is from the Salt People clan. And I mentioned that I'm originally from Shiprock, New Mexico, and I now live in Tempe, Arizona. I'd like to continue the tradition of honoring the land Arizona State University and the Center for Indian Education resides on, which is the ancestral homelands of the American Indian tribes that have inhabited this land for centuries. They include the Akmil Atum and Pipash peoples. So as Dr. Brayboy mentioned in the previous webinar, Akmil Atum and Pipash peoples are still in the valley today. They're doctors, farmers, lawyers, ASU students, and they continue to be caretakers of the lands their ancestors stewarded, end quote. For the past 62 years, the Center for Indian Education has developed countless programs, research projects, reports, Indigenous education courses, and publication that all together furthers our understanding of knowledge within Indigenous education. I encourage you all to visit the CIE 60th Celebration webinar website for 3 reasons. First, to read the bios and see the photos of all 11 previous directors in the Honoring CIE Directors link. Secondly, to visit the historical timeline link to learn more about the key milestones and accomplishments as they relate to the CIE mission. Our webinar series today and today's conversation is a really good addition to that timeline. And thirdly, to read our director's thoughts about what the next 60 years of Indigenous education may hold. I want to pause and would like to publicly acknowledge and thank the CIE 60th Celebration Staff Planning Committee members. They include Dr. Deborah Chadwick, Taylor Nota, Andrea Underwood, Jeannie Colquette, Jim Salisbury. I also want to thank the Executive Planning Committee, who include Doctors Loma Waima, McCarty, and Brayboy for their leadership. And of course, thank you to our audience who are watching on the School of Social Transformation YouTube channel and also on ASU Live. We appreciate you joining today's conversation. I encourage you to submit questions for our panelists in the YouTube channel chat box. Our CIE program coordinator, Dr. Deborah Chadwick, will be reading the questions from the audience during the Q&A period. So it's now, I'm so excited to introduce today's panelists because I've known them for many years. Their research and scholarship relating to Indigenous education has been welcome within the field of Indigenous education. You know, it also has informed my own learning, and I really enjoyed sharing their scholarship and articles and book chapters with my students. So I'll introduce them in the order in which they'll begin. We'll have opening questions in which the panelists will be asked to speak for about 5 minutes to the question, and then we'll look forward to the rich back and forth dialogue among the panelists. And we have reserved time for a Q&A dialogue where our panelists will respond to questions submitted from the audience. So with that said, welcome panelists. We're so pleased to have you with us today as we share this space in this virtual gathering. Our first panelist is Dr. Theresa Ambo, who is Lisenyo, Tangba, and Tono A'atam. She's an assistant professor at the University of California, San Diego in the Department of Education Studies, which is located on Kumeyaay territory. She holds a BA, MA, and PhD from UCLA, which is on Tongva territory. She was a UC President's Postdoc Fellow from 2017 through 2019. Dr. Ambo's research focuses on issues related to American Indian educational equity and inclusion, including student outcomes and community university partnerships. Her core research really examines relationships between universities and local Native nations in California. Throughout her use of case study design, she offers institutionally transferable insights on tribal university relationships, also institutional responsibilities articulated by tribal and campus leaders, and post-secondary educational needs of Native nations. So welcome, Theresa Ambo. Our second panelist is Dr. Jameson J.D. Lopez. He is a Quechan Indian tribal member located in Fort Yuma, California. He was born in the Phoenix Indian Medical Center in 1985 and was raised in a predominantly white neighborhood in North Phoenix. Upon completing his bachelor's degree from American Indian College, he then earned his master's and doctoral degrees from Arizona State University. Dr. Lopez is an Indigenous quantitative researcher with expertise in limitations of collecting and applying quantitative results to Indigenous populations, and which focuses on American Indian higher education. He carries unique experience through his research that includes a 2010 deployment to Iraq as a platoon leader, where he received a Bronze Star Medal for actions during combat. He hopes he makes the Native American community proud as he embarks on a tenure-track professor position at the University of Arizona. So join me in welcoming Dr. Lopez. Our third panelist is Dr. Amanda Tachini. She's Navajo from Ganado, Arizona. She is Nanastesia Tachini, which translates to Zuni Red Running into the Water Clan born for Klizaflane, which is the Menegoats clan. She is an assistant professor in the Educational Leadership and Innovation at Arizona State University. Dr. Tachini's research centers on exploring college student using qualitative Indigenous methodologies. She is drawn to contribute to research that focuses on systemic and structural barriers that really disenfranchise college access for Indigenous and marginalized communities. Welcome, Dr. Tachini. Given that I've known our panelists for years, I've seen them mentor many, many students, and I've had the privilege to hear them share stories of their mentors. So we're in for a treat today as they share their perspectives of mentorship. So I'd like to begin our conversation by asking each of the panelists to talk about, let me think about this. I'd like to begin our conversation by asking each of the panelists to take about 5 minutes to address a two-part question. The first part is, what inspired you to enter the field of Indigenous education? And secondly, what or who has profoundly impacted your thinking? Dr. Ambo, we'll start with you, and then followed by Dr. Lopez, and then Dr. Tachini.
Thank you, Dr. Ben. I appreciate the introduction. Miyu Yum, hello everybody. Thank you for joining us today from the comfort of your homes, I hope, or offices. And thank you to Drs. Brayboy and Dr. Ben for the invitation to speak on this panel, and to all those at CIE who are involved in planning the 60th anniversary series. It really is an honor to be on this panel today. I'm coming to you all today from Carlsbad, California, which is located at the northernmost part of Luiseño territory and is shared with our relatives to the south, the Kumeyaay. And I first want to say that it is sincerely a distinct honor to be on this panel with Dr. Tachini and Dr. Lopez. They are two people who I've known for a while in different capacities, and I sincerely respect and admire their research. And I feel like I'm a baby scholar in many ways, and I recognize them as scholars who are highly regarded in our field already, and they're just at the beginning of their careers. And so it really is an honor, and I'm very humbled to share this space with you today. And so thank you. Preparing for the panel was a wonderful opportunity to reflect on mentorship, and not just who has mentored me and how, but also how I mentor others. And this question that you asked, Dr. Ben, it particularly got me thinking about not just how I was inspired to pursue Indigenous education, but more so what called me to the field of Indigenous education. And I use the word called because I sincerely think and feel that being in our positions and doing the work associated with this role or these roles is truly a calling. The reality is securing a tenure track faculty position at a Research One institution, and for these two at a top 10 program, is really an accomplishment. And I jokingly refer to this often as something similar to being drafted for the NBA or the NFL. But in truth, when you really look at the numbers of doctorates awarded each year, and faculty, they laughed a little bit, and faculty positions that are available, the likelihood of us sitting here and the likelihood of us being in this role is really small. And so in part, it's a reflection of hard work, sacrifice, love, support, and of course, why we're here today, of mentorship. But I also think it reflects a divine purpose. And so when I say the word or use the word calling, I use it very seriously. And that's the perspective I'll take when I answer questions today, and this question in particular. And so without a doubt, my educational experience and my pursuit of my education or higher education was really influenced by the experiences, the educational experiences of my ancestors, my family, my community, and students. They all inspired me to pursue higher education in different ways. But today I want to highlight a turning point in my life that really galvanized this calling for me. And so it's important for me to briefly acknowledge that I'm a first-generation college student. I grew up in an industrial city right outside of Los Angeles, on my Tongva homelands. And I'm a daughter of a homemaker and an electrician of 30 years, and I have 4 other siblings. I'm the second to the last child born, but I was the first to pursue a 4-year degree. And I had what other people might consider a traditional path into higher education, having started at UCLA as a freshman. But the journey quickly took a turn, and it led me to this turning point that inspired my, or led to my calling in higher education, or Indigenous education, I should say. And it happened in the fall quarter of my senior year. And I always share very candidly about this experience. But in the fall of my senior year, I was kicked out of UCLA for academic performance, or lack thereof. And in that moment, I felt incredibly ashamed, and I felt guilty. I felt like I didn't belong. I put a lot of blame on myself. I felt inadequate and unintelligent. And my first thought went to my parents. They made numerous sacrifices for me so that I could be the first person in my family to attend a 4-year university. And I felt stuck. I felt like I had this incredible amount of pressure to perform, and I was stuck between that and honoring, or what I felt was dishonoring, my family's sacrifice, and not just my parents, my siblings too. And so that happened in that moment. At the same time, I thought about my peers, a lot of my friends and students that I was working with. And in that moment, I knew with the utmost certainty that I didn't want other students to experience what I was experiencing, especially Indigenous students, and especially knowing that it was unnecessary. And so this is a single moment in my life that I have always and will likely always identify as the impetus behind what called me to work in the field of Indigenous education. And it really shaped my research and how I approach mentoring the next generation of Indigenous students. And so I don't want to take up too much more time, but I want to close by sharing that after a lot of reflection, I recognized that my struggles weren't really a reflection of me, but they were really a reflection of larger systemic educational issues. And that's really what led me to interrogate, critique, and challenge institutions, their legacy, their structure, organization, their policies. Institutions need to be more accountable, and that is something that I try to push forward in my research in particular. And a few sessions ago, Dr. Bang, she made a comment, and she said, I want institutions to start harming us. And that really resonated with me. And I call on Megan or Dr. Bang in particular as someone who's inspired me and who inspires my work, but also Dr. Brayboy, Dr. Punihe Light at UH Manoa, and the late Bobby Wright, who are all interrogating in their own and different ways institutional relationships and how institutions can be more accountable to Native people and Native communities. And so that's what I'll share with you all today. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Ambo. Oh, sorry, Colin, did I interrupt? Dr. Ben.
That's totally fine. Feel free to respond, Dr. Lopez.
I appreciate it. And thanks again for having me. Thanks to CIE for the invitation. Just knowing the other panelists and previous webinars, and all the individuals that are in there, Dr. Brayboy, Dr. Loma Waima, McCarty, and so forth. It's just, and yeah, for sure, Dr. Faircloth. It makes you kind of feel like just a Chevy Cavalier among Cadillacs or something like that, or like I'm the great value brand of Dr. Brayboy or something. Hey, but I'm very happy to be here. I share this story often of what inspired me to go into the field of Indigenous ed, and really it's my mother. My mom, she grew up in a 1-bedroom mud house, no shoes, one dress in the middle of the Sonoran Desert. And, her story is one that I hold with me because, she experienced so much of life at an early age, being abused. Her parents were in the boarding school era, brought some of that trauma back to our community and within our family. It all kind of culminated in her adolescence with my with my grandfather passing away of alcohol poisoning when she was 12, and she saw him just right outside of the mud house just beneath their mesquite tree. And my mom seen him there, you know, like where it seems all hope is kind of lost. She decided at that point, you know, like, you know, what's next? And in that same year, a group of Native college students came to our reservation, actually led by a Tohono O'odham man, Jake Escalante. He brought those Native students to our res that went to college, and, you know, they looked like her, smelled like her, ate like her. And my mom saw them and said, and they told her, you know, you could go to college, you can make it. And my mom at the age of 12, like completely changed the legacy of our families. And so I hold that. And she went on to teach at a small college called American Indian College, which is a non-profit private college along there with my dad, who's an administrator. And I saw them really just commit their life to Indigenous students. You know, we always had Native students at our house growing up. We were always going to reservations and into the community, and my parents were recruiting on a very, very like one-on-one basis, like sitting in living rooms. We're all in the trailers out in the middle of nowhere, sleeping in people's houses that we hardly knew. And it really inspired me, because now, like, I've seen my mom and my dad, they help graduate hundreds of Native college students who then go back into their community. And I think back to that one experience they had of just saying, like, hey, there was a group of Native college students, and my mom making that decision to change the legacy of our family. And for me, it's just very impactful in what I wanted to do. And I wanted to continue that legacy from my family. And I think for me, that's really impacted my thinking overall too, and just this idea of like how we're measuring educational success from a Native standpoint. And so I hold that experience for me in just about every work that I do. And it's also my motivation to make sure that I'm putting my best foot forward and that my efforts are there. And so anyways, I'll leave it there, and I'll toss it over to Dr. Ticini.
Thank you, Dr. Lopez, for sharing your thoughts and stories about who has inspired you. Dr. Ticini, would you like to go next?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, I want to reiterate what my friends and colleagues here are sharing about the amount of gratitude I have for putting this together. It's just, I've been watching every single one of them, and it's just been so awe-inspiring to hear our legacies from the first one to then be a part of this conversation. It's just really amazing, you know, to think that we are part of this larger collective of really fighting for our people when it comes to Indigenous education. And I want to just give a shout out to CIE, the Center for Indian Education. When I used to work there as a postdoc, and I remember walking in the halls of the building and thinking about all the people who walked in those on that campus that were Native, really fighting for self-determination there in a time of termination of our people, and really set the framework for us to be able to have an honest conversation about Indigenous ed today. And there's so many wonderful people that are in my heart and mind that I want to just give gratitude to. So thank you so much. You know, this question too, like Theresa was saying, it's been really good to just think about mentorship and to think about what is bringing us today in this conversation. I just love that we're talking about this, because I think it's something that we need to give attention to. And it also really rekindles really good feelings when you think about the people who have shaped our experiences. I definitely believe all of us think, no, we don't get to these places or to this point in our life by ourselves, that we are part of generations of folks who have shaped us. And that's really antithetical to most of our colleges and the way they think, right? And so it's been really, so we take that into stock. When I was thinking about who inspired me to get an education like JD and Theresa, I think about my mom. I think about her strength. I grew up too in on the res. I didn't realize we were living paycheck to paycheck because everything felt good, but recognizing till I'm older how much my mom, she was a single mother, making ends meet, and also trying to get a college degree at the same time. I have an older brother and a little sister. Thank goodness we were surrounded by my larger extended family. So I was often at my grandma's house and my uncle's house, and so, but I give her a lot of credit because I remember first going on college campuses when I was a little girl, because she would take classes in the summer just to get her degree completed. And I think that was the first awakening for me about higher education, was because of being on campus with her. And then she soon therefore got a degree in education. And so then I grew up going to her classroom. I remember growing up having to erase her chalkboard. Then we had chalkboard, and I loved cleaning for her. And sometimes she would let me even grade easy stuff like true false essays. She was a social studies teacher, and she would let me grade. And so I was already trained, so to speak, about education from my mom. And my grandma too. So my grandma didn't get a degree, but she had knowledge of the land and medicine. And sometimes our school would call my grandma to help out as a nurse, because the nurses would leave usually. Sometimes they wouldn't last a full year back on the res, like the ones who were designated the nurse, who had the credentials. So my grandma was the one who would be in the school helping my classmates, my friends. And I remember I used to just like sneak away and go sit in the nurse's office with her, just be with her, because I just love my grandma. So like those kinds of things, I just feel like it was just part of me. And I love Theresa's notion of calling. And I feel like that's been a part of my upbringing already, is understanding the value and the importance of acquiring and getting an education. And so I give them a lot of credit, and they still are part of my thinking in terms of the work that I do about how am I being like my grandmother. She's passed now. I mean, she's still with me right here. And I think constantly about what would my grandma want me to do. So I give a lot of credit to my matriarchs and my family. And the question about what or who has profoundly impacted your thinking, there's so many to name, but I think right now what's really on my heart is the land and context have been my teachers. We've been in a state of the pandemic now for over a year, and we have seen the unfolding of anti-Blackness crimes, xenophobia against our Asian relatives, challenges to our trans relatives. It's going on and on and on. And I think all of us can relate that this has been going on for way too long, centuries old. And so this has all of this stuff that we're dealing with of death and trauma has really been foundational for me in terms of sharpen my analytical thinking right now. I feel like before I was kind of hesitant to really call out white supremacy, call out settler colonialism, call out xenophobia and all of that, just because I was like JD and Theresa alluded to, a baby junior scholar. Like I feel like Brian Brayboy and Dr. Loboe on the court, LeBron James, and they're out there playing ball and slam dunking it, and I'm like getting the water. I'm like on the bench, right? And so like it's that feeling of like, okay, do I start naming these? I mean, it's just like coming into yourself as a person, as a scholar. And I feel like though this time of the context of land and what we're dealing with is making me like be sharper in my thinking and knowing who I am. So I give a lot of credit to those knowledges that is happening. And when I say land, I mean this time of the pandemic, I've been doing a lot of gardening and farming with my family, really thinking about food sovereignty and thinking about our relationship to the land. And in a place, I'm on Acoma O'odham Pipash lands, and respecting that is my Acoma O'odham land, and I'm Navajo, and I'm learning to cultivate corn in the desert. What does that mean? And also land meaning I've been weaving a lot. This tapestry behind me is an example of an old 1930s textile from Ardenne people. And so what does that mean? Because that's connected to land. And what am I learning about the weaving? So I want to give credit to the land and the context of time that's sharpening who I am as an Indigenous educator.
Thank you so much, Amanda, and to Theresa and JD for all of your responses to our first opening question. Before we transition to the next set of questions, I want to reflect and highlight some of the key points of your responses that you just gave. I think one of the common thread that united all your responses is really how you each acknowledge how valuable our families are in our educational journeys, whether that be parents or grandparents. So I'm really glad that you brought that to the forefront. Dr. Ambo, you raised the point about how, you were honoring your family's sacrifice, in your educational pursuits, being a first generation student. And that's such a beautiful point that a lot of us can relate to. And Dr. Lopez, I'm glad that you made us think about and share your mother's experience of when she was a child, she was told that she could go to school. And that phrase, that interaction that she had was such a profound turning point for your family that, it's great that we have these individuals going out into the community and sharing these positive messages and recruiting more Native and Indigenous students throughout Indian country that they too could go to college. And Dr. Tachini, I really just liked your message about how we're all part of this larger collective of fighting for Indian education. I think that really has been a common theme throughout each of the 5 webinars that we've had, from the previous directors, throughout the well-established scholars, and to the junior scholars. So thank you for having us think about that. So now let's continue our conversation. And I want to ask another question. I would like to encourage the panelists to engage with one another in a dialogue around this next question. What constitutes good or effective mentoring? And the second part to that question is considering both receiving and offering mentorship. So what constitutes good and effective mentoring, considering both receiving and offering mentorship? Dr. Tachini, would you like to begin this conversation?
Yeah, thank you for that question. That's a really hard question. I'll be frank. But I feel like it's been really, the reason why I say that is because what I share with you is from my thinking and how I've been shaped by mentors who have shaped me, and how I see mentorship, recognizing that it may look different for everybody. Fundamentally, mentoring to me is about relationships, and it's a verb. Mentoringship is a verb, so there's action involved. It's an action-oriented way of being. And what I strive to see as mentorship, and I'm using the knowledge system here, is this idea of k'eh. K'eh is about kinship. It's being in relations to everyone, with all. But connected to k'eh is this idea of hojon, which is this, there isn't a word that describes it. I'm going to do my best, but it's going to still flatten the beauty of hojon. Is actually beauty and peace and goodness and balance. And so mentoring, then, if we were going to think about it through these ideas of k'eh and of kinship, and through hojon of balance, it's being in right relations with others. So what does right relations mean, right? It means, for me, it's being intentional in my relationships with people and being meaningful in that intentionality. It means love in that process. It means kindness, graciousness, and generative of our time and our energies, and the time and energies we receive. And what I try to think about, and I'm not always good at this, like I'm just visioning stuff, is also this idea of cultivating them. So in a mentorship, in this relationship, we're cultivating a sacred person to be their truest and the most beautiful self that they can be and that they are. So in many ways, for me, I see it too as being an auntie. I'm an auntie to many, and I was raised by a lot of wonderful, stern aunties, who tell me what I should do when I need to hear it. So it's those recognizing that as mentoring in this relationship, there's sternness too. There's a way of like knowing, aunties are good about knowing when there's dangers coming. Either you're doing damages for yourself, behaviors for yourself, or in the future, and to be aware of that. And often that can sound as bossy or like controlling, but if it's really from a genuine place of k'eh and hojon, where I talked about, then it kind of shifts in the way in which the words are said or how the environment feels when the telling is occurring or when the relationship is happening. So I really think about, you know, I was inspired by Chris Nelson and Natalie Youngbold. They actually wrote a piece on mentorship. And the title of that piece is called Indigenous Knowledge Realized, Understanding the Role of Service Learning at the Intersection of Being a Mentor and a College-Going American Indian. And in that piece, they note that, in quotes, it's a cyclical power that positively impacts the collective. And that's really beautiful. How does then, if we think about that then, that the relationship creates a cyclical power. And I feel myself just wanting to turn my fingers, cyclical power that reinforces a positive ways, positive energies for the collective, for that circle. So some of the ways then that I think about powerful mentors who have shaped me, and these are lessons learned and actually quotes I feel like I've come in my life. I'm so grateful to Creator, because sometimes I feel like mentors come when you need it. And I say in my heart, that's like a little angels for me that needed me at that we came together at the right time in the right moment. And some of the things they say, I kind of carry to heart. So one of my mentors told me, like, you know, taught me like to check your ego. Really, like, I had a wonderful mentor who helped me to better understand that sometimes we see that mentors, that there's an expertise, there's almost like a hierarchy of one over the other. And she taught me about, she had to check her ego because she didn't know some things about indigenous knowledge. She was non-native. And she had to surrender feeling like she was the expert and allow me to be in my creative self and assert indigenous knowledge system in my research. And I thought that was so profound that she said she had to check her ego to allow me to grow and develop and do what I would like to do. And so I'm thinking, in long times when I'm mentoring students, I have to check mine too, because I'm so used to anti-mode too, like getting into that, telling, you know, students or whoever this is what you should do and so forth. And I have to think about, you know, what am I saying, or how are the words I'm saying it impacting, or my actions, or what's the energy I'm creating in the environment. Another advice that I received from a mentor was recognizing that often in academic spaces, relationships are created for self-interest, for individual gain, like there is a motive. And when I first heard that was like, no, I don't want to hear that. But there's a lot of truth to that. So it's recognizing that sometimes relationships you have to kind of think about what are the underlying systems of power that are creating the conditions of like competitiveness and hierarchy. And then how then do you hold your ground to your sense of and hojon and your personhood in these types of relationships? And then how do myself as a mentor peel away those layers of what I'm calling systemic monsters, these white supremacy, settler, colonial, capitalist, neoliberal ways of mentorship. So it's a constant examining of myself too. And then the last thing I'll say, and I know our colleagues will share much deeper things, is this idea is that relationships change over time. They grow and develop, and they transcend generations. So there are periods and there's periods where there's distances too between mentors, and that's okay. Sometimes mentors become friends. Sometimes mentors shape into sisters and brothers, and then evolve or separate and spring forth somewhere else. Sometimes relationships can be harmful too. So it's recognizing that if there's hurting involved, or you're hurting someone, it's doing some introspective thinking of yourself also. And how can we return to K'e and Hojon to begin to get into these right relations?
Thank you, Amanda, for framing your response to that question through a Navajo lens of using, Diné philosophy and epistemology of K'e and Hojon. That's a great response. Dr. Lopez, JD, would you like to respond to that question?
Oh yeah, sure. I mean, honestly, I don't think I think about mentorship as deeply as Dr. Ticini does. I mean, for me, I think when I think about some of my best mentors, there's one in particular event that I'm thinking about, and it's with Dr. Margarita Jimenez Silva. We used to have our mentorship meetings. She was my research supervisor. And we used to have our meetings in the morning at like 6 a.m. I was the early riser, she was too. And so we'd meet at the office and she would go over our mentoring or whatever research projects we were doing. And I remember one morning, I was up there, it's like at Arizona State University in I think it was Farmers Education Building on the 3rd floor. And I was waiting outside her office and she shows up and she has one of her kind of tote bags, you know. I feel like a lot of teachers use that. She was a former teacher, and she came up and she goes, "Hey, JD," and I was like, "Hi, Dr. Jimenez Silva, how's it going?" And she's like, "Good." She goes, "Are you hungry?" And I remember thinking like, "Oh yeah, like I haven't ate breakfast. Yeah, it sounds great." She goes, "Let's go get a breakfast burrito." And I was like, "Oh, okay." And I was thinking maybe there was like a food truck outside. But she goes, "Hold on, let's go in the office. We'll go in the office." And I was like, "Okay." So I follow her as we go into the office, and she's talking, we're going over our research projects. I can't remember what we were doing at the time. And then as she's talking, she reaches into her tote bag and she pulls out like a hot plate, puts it on the table, plugs it in, still talking. Then she goes in, she pulls out her eggs, and then she pulls out her bacon, and then she pulls out some tortillas. And I was like, oh my God, she's like Mary Poppins or something. She just keeps pulling stuff out of her bag. And she's sitting there talking about research this whole time and like making me a breakfast burrito, or 2, actually. I think she made me 2. And I think about that like level of mentorship and just to Dr. Ticini's point about the relationship building and all of that. And I was just like, it stuck with me. And I was like, she genuinely cares about how I'm doing in this program. But on a practical standpoint, I think it was that she gave me opportunity. And like a lot of times in my mind, I was like, I could do this. I just need somebody to give me an opportunity. Just give me a chance. Give me a chance. Like I know it. And so for me, when I go back into thinking about, along what Dr. Ticini was saying about relationships, I try to build those relationships, but then also in a sense, on a practical standpoint for my students, I'm just trying to build opportunity for them to try to set them up for success as well. So.
I'd like to add to the conversation. I think similarly, opportunities, intentionality, generosity, authenticity, honesty, tough love, or high standards, those are values or ways that people support us on our journeys. Something that I wanted to add, my introduction and my idea of mentorship comes from participating in a program at UCLA called Supporting Undergraduate Natives, SUN. And so I participated in that program for about 15 years and saw it evolve over that time, and saw a lot of really successful student-to-student mentorship relationships. When I had the opportunity to run the program, we put students with faculty and staff into families. And we saw very beautifully, very organically, these relationships form. Like Dr. Ticini said, mentorship relationships, the foundation of it is relationality and relationships. And so something that I want to recognize is that mentorship is often, it happens in very informal and sometimes formal ways. And it really isn't until we have some hindsight that we recognize that these people were our mentors. And so in my job as a faculty, I have a department appointed or university appointed faculty mentor, Dr. Frances Contreras, and she's phenomenal. And I recognize that we have a formal relationship. And then during my schooling, I had faculty, either as professors or as advisors, who I had informal and formal mentorship relationships with. And it wasn't really until hindsight came in to perspective that I recognized that I was mentored and supported by some of the best. My faculty advisor was Sylvia Hurtado, who's prolific when it comes to climate research, campus climate research and higher education. But I didn't have really formal mentorship from Indigenous education or not Indigenous education, American Indian Studies faculty, because I wasn't in that program. And so in hindsight, I can reflect on these really crucial and critical and transformative relationships that I had with Professor Dwayne Champagne and Professor Shannon Speed and Mashana Goldman. And some of the things that I recognize now in hindsight is that they were very generous with their time. I wasn't their student, but they made time for me to do fellowships or summer research, or provided me countless opportunities. My faculty advisor, Sylvia, held me to extremely high standard. Sometimes it felt like she was criticizing me unnecessarily, but I recognized that she was holding me to a high standard because she knew that I was capable. And all of these professors, I would add, they offered me opportunities. And so I was talking a little bit with my spouse about this yesterday, and he was saying, what actually did they do and, that made them different mentors? And something that I recognize in myself is I am inherently and innately rebellious. I blame my parents in particular. And so whenever someone tells me go left, I'm gonna go right, or I'm gonna ask why. If somebody says walk through that door, I'm gonna walk in the opposite direction. And so something I recognize all these faculty mentors did for me was they showed me a door. And at some points in time, they would open the door for me, but they never pushed me through it. And I had a realization that yesterday when talking to my spouse that, this in fact was something that they all did for me, was they all provided opportunities, research, summer research program opportunities, opportunities to write papers for them or with them or for their class in particular. But they never pushed too hard. They just said, here's the opportunity, Theresa, here's how you do the research, here's some advice in particular. But they let me find the door myself. They let me turn the knob and they let me walk through it. And if it really wasn't for that gentle approach, I don't think that I would have ever gone through the door myself. And so that's what I would add to that question.
Thank you for that, Dr. Ambo. And I think what you shared, is pretty powerful, that relationships do matter, and that, mentors can and really do have that genuine interest to share opportunities that you and Dr. Lopez shared. Okay, we'll move on to the next question. What advice would you give to the next generation of Indigenous scholars and educators? Dr. Lopez, would you like to start this dialogue?
Sure, I don't mind. Thinking about this question, and I hope our answers are different, but I think for me, like telling the next generation of Indigenous scholars, I would just say kind of embrace that fear. I think for me, at least, I've always felt this sense of fear of doing things, even speaking. I generally don't like speaking, even doing interviews and stuff. It's not something I enjoy doing all the time. I don't say that even being on a webinar, but I think what encourages me is this thought of my community, though. If I don't do this, who else from my community is going to do it, and where is our representation going to be? And I think that's what gives me strength, is my community. And so for me, it's always staying grounded in your community and looking across academia. Sometimes it's easy to get lost in the ivory tower and people lose sight of their tribal community. So try to stay grounded in that, because it's going to give you your why. It's going to give you why you're doing what you're doing, because I'm telling you, the institutions, plural, are going to fail you, and they're going to fail you again, and they're going to discourage you. And it's going to be tough to stay the course. U of A furloughed us for a while, and sometimes it's hard not to be bitter, and this is me just talking real. It's hard not to be bitter towards what's happening, but in my same mindset, it's like, well, why am I doing this? I'm doing it for my community, and although like it's through this tough time, like, you know, I'm still committed to my community. And it gives me the sense of, you know what, I'm not committed to U of A. I wasn't committed to ASU when I was there. I'm committed to my purpose. I'm committed to my relatives and my tribal community to make sure that we're represented well and we're contributing towards nation building and giving back. And that really helps me. And don't be afraid to put yourself out there. You know, I keep all of my rejection letters, every single one of them. You send me a rejection. So to all the foundations out there, if anybody's listening, I keep those letters and I hold them in my pocket, you know, and it's a reminder, you know, and it's the same even when I went into my PhD program. I applied to 2 programs, ASU, one at ASU and one to University of Arizona. I only got into one, and that was at Arizona State University. And the other one, I now work at as a tenure track faculty. So the very program that denied my application into their PhD program hired me as a faculty. So I don't hang up my diploma on my wall, I hang up my rejection letter. So don't be afraid to put yourself out there. Don't be afraid of the rejection because it's coming. And always keep your purpose and your why at the core of what you're doing, because it's gonna free you up. You're not gonna be concerned about what an institution's doing. You're gonna be concerned about the people, and that's what this is all about. So that's my best advice. So.
If I can give advice, and it's related to what Dr. Lopez said, is to show up and to show out. And so that means so many things, and you can take it any way that you want. But I really call on the next generations of scholars and educators to show up for one another, and show support for one another. I think that academia and education can be so individualistic and can be so incredibly isolating. And so I think it's important for us to show up for each other, to show support, to recognize that we aren't in competition with each other. We're not here to challenge anybody's ideas in a way that is competitive, but we're here to continuously expand on each other's thinking and to grow and to develop as people and as communities in academia and inside of academia. And when I think about students, I think, you know, show up and show out as well. Show up to your classes and be unapologetically Indigenous. Indigeneity isn't a hat that you can take off. It's not a part-time job. You don't, there is a theorization around walking in 2 worlds, but we are always Indigenous people. We're always bringing our ancestors and our family with us wherever we go. It's not something that you leave at the door when you walk into a classroom. And so I really encourage the next generation, and even try to remind myself, show up and be unapologetically who you are. And the other thing that I would say when I say show up, do your reading, speak up in class, you know, be present, participate in your education, and don't be afraid of being intelligent or asking a dumb question or proposing a really innovative or untraditional study. And so that's some of the advice that I would give the next generation of scholars and educators. And I'm really excited to hear what Dr. Tachini has to say.
Y'all are getting me all pumped up. Those are so good advice. I think what I would offer would be, because I'm a mom of 3, I have a freshman college student, I have a middle school, and I have a first grader. And if they can, one thing they teach me is mom, me time, or we time. And so for me, I have to remember my families first. And that includes, I live in a multi-generational home. My mom lives with me. We take care of each other. My husband also, sometimes my husband, the kids come and then a mom, then the husband, and that can be problematic. So it's like taking care of the people who are close to you, who love you, you know, and I feel like I have to constantly remind that. I mean, with the pandemic, we're all settled now. We're not as traveling as much as we used to. And it's making me, that's why I said earlier, this time and context is teaching me that our energies are limited. We never know when our last days is going to happen. And so with the time that we have, be thoughtful about the energies that you expend each day and what's going to take it away and what's going to add to your time. So I like to say that sometimes we get distracted by the system, distracted where it just depletes our energy, where we just feel like we can't do anymore because we're running on a cycle. We're running like rats around. And Toni Morrison says that's a distraction when you are constantly trying to advocate for who you are and to systems that don't listen. And sometimes we have to just be aware of that. And like Toni Morrison says, is it takes you away from your purpose, your true calling, which Theresa started off with already, of why you're here. And sometimes that can get blurry when you're an academic and you're a mom, because I want to take care and help the next generation and do some stuff for Indigenous ed. And then that means being here for my baby and reading with her when it's reading time. And so it's like negotiating through all of that is important. So take care of your spirit, know your energies and what expends it and what gives it so much life where you can flourish, and start learning what that is and do that work. The other thing I would say in the connection to Theresa's thought about reading, read outside of even Indigenous ed. I mean, I find so much strength in reading Black feminist, Black queer work, because we need more solidarity efforts to really fight these systemic monsters. And we need to lock arms with folks who are feeling the struggle too. And how can we do that? We can start being intellectually rigorous with their work, because there's so much out there. And so I definitely encourage you to use your time when you're just chilling. There's so much to learn if we engage in the deep intellectual thinking of people who've been writing for generations.
Thank you so much to our panelists who offered us great advice on, to the next generation of scholars and educators. Thank you. I really appreciate your thought and thoughtful response to that question. The next question that I'll ask to the panelists is, what do you see as the potential opportunities and threats to the future of Indigenous education? Let me repeat that question. What do you see as potential opportunities and threats to the future of Indigenous education? Dr. Ambo, would you be interested in addressing this from your perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. My perspective comes from being a faculty of higher education and being a faculty in an institution of higher education. And as somebody who studies these systems, right? I'm a systems person, and I focus on how systems or institutions or organizations and how their behaviors affect individuals. And so something that I've seen over the last almost 2 years as a professor, but I see in my research, and I saw as a student organizer and activist and just a student in academia, and why I do my work, and what called me to this work was really seeing an issue of, and I'll start with threats and I'll end on a high note to talk about potential opportunities. I see a level of ignorance of non-Indigenous people about Indigenous people. And so one of the questions I ask people who are participating in or who participate in my research is, what relationship do you have with Indigenous people in the local area? And people will point blank tell me, I'm not aware of any people in the immediate area. Or they're so far away, right? That Native people aren't in urban spaces, they haven't been relocated, that there aren't non-federally recognized tribes, but there's only Native nations that are located on or within reservations. And so I think ignorance is a real threat to the future of Indigenous education, especially when we think about higher education institutions and what they do in our society. I think paternalism is also a huge threat. Talking about us without us, or pretending to know what we need to know, pretending or acting as if you know better for us. This has been an issue that we've had since before the founding of this country, right? Settlers coming in and assuming that they know what's better for us than we know for ourselves. And so paternalism I see as a big threat. And another threat I see is exclusion. Indigenous people are not only excluded from systems, but when they are actually within systems, they aren't a part of these conversations, right? I have a I would call her a mentor. She doesn't. She probably would. It'd be news to her. But a mentor and someone who I look up to in Indigenous education, Jolie Proudfoot, and she's at California State University, San Marcos, and directs the Center for Indian Education there, or the I'll leave the name out. But she says, "Not about us, without us." And she wants to put it on a t-shirt. So you might see me wearing a t-shirt into a meeting sometime with it. But she talks about how often Indigenous people are excluded from conversations and they're left out, even in EDI spaces. And so I think that these are potential threats to Indigenous education. To close, and then I'll pass it over to Dr. Tacchini and Dr. Lopez as a potential site of opportunity. And Dr. Tacchini writes about this quite a bit, and I'll see her tweets on it too. I think a potential opportunity for us is really solidarity. How can we link arms with other communities? How can people from racialized and marginalized communities really be allies and work in true solidarity with Indigenous people? And Dr. Tacchini, she writes, she's going to be hosting a conference on Black and Indigenous solidarity. And so I think that that is a potential opportunity, especially now given the climate of our country, in light of more public racial incidents that have been happening, as a potential avenue for us pursuing opportunities in Indigenous education.
Yeah, I'll just piggyback off of what you shared, because lately I've been so inspired by the movements that's occurring right now. And when I say movements, I think about abolitionist thinkers are really on the streets. They're echoing in buildings saying no more. And I think more and more people are listening. And I also thinking I'm really inspired by the Native folks who are right there too. You know, yesterday, the Red Nation, they just launched their new book called The Red Deal. And they're really thinking about, they're inspiring me because they're harnessing this collective energy. And they give much credit to Black feminist thinking and their theorizing and their approach. And they're also saying no more. So I that's why I share that. I feel like there's opportunities for us to learn from each other and to line efforts, but also recognizing there's still differences in the challenge, our histories, but it's not mutually exclusive in relationships and the issues that are at hand. So what I'm also encouraged about is that I see that foundations are providing support for this type of work. Spencer did a call for this to support research that looks at, you know, injustice, racial injustice. Lumina is did a strategic plan, and one of their initiatives is to look at this too. So there are these potential funding support to do this work, which gets people like us all fired up, because we're doing this work not for our tenure. I mean, that's not even in our mind. We're doing this work to help our people. And if funding can support in those efforts, then it just pumps us up. It's like, let's do this. So I think those are opportunities that stretches us in those directions. I'm also inspired by Dr. Megan Bing that she shared on the on this webinar about saying that we need to do these efforts and not think they're only confined in institutions. You know, that was so freeing. Like, we can do this work without these structures. I mean, and like the work she's cultivating. And after I heard that, I text JD, I was like, let's do something. And like, now we're thinking about it. It just like ignited, put a seed in us. And now we're like, all right, so look out for what work that JD and I and others start creating. And so I feel like there's limitless opportunities. In regards to threats, I'm not going to spend much time on it, because you know what? They're ongoing, they have been, and they will continue. And if you're an Indigenous person in this settler colonial nation state, We know we've learned to fight and we've continued to fight. And so let's put our efforts on opportunities.
Yeah, and just echoing what Dr. Ambo and Dr. Ticini said, I think it's not necessarily worth the time to talk about all of the threats that we've seen in Indigenous ed. I mean, we could go back to the point of the 1928 Merriam Report that kind of gave the status of where Indian country was in the 20s. In that education section, they're starting to talk about culturally relevant education, not in those words, but around it, they start talking about the need for more funding and teacher resources and more qualified teachers to go into Indigenous communities. Recognizing that standard testing within Native communities wasn't really working, and you could go fast forward to 2018, and it's the same exact recommendations. We need culturally sustaining pedagogy. We need more highly qualified teachers. We need more funding. We can't use the standardized testing as biased. And so if nothing has really changed within 90 years, those threats are probably going to still exist the next few decades. And so focusing on those, I think may not be worth the time as much as focusing on the opportunities. And I think that's where I see a big opportunities is with Indigenous data sovereignty. This idea of collecting and analyzing our own data from a community values perspective. And to me, that's exciting because the capacity of Indian country and the ability to do this type of research work and insert it into academia is growing, and that's exciting for me, qualitative and quantitative. But reimagining how we are looking at those outcomes, how we're measuring educational success from a tribal perspective. I often think about going back into my own community and asking our elders, okay, to you, what is a successful college student? And none of them mentioned GPA. Nobody mentioned first and second persistence rates or graduation rates. They were saying, what are you giving back to our community? How are you giving back to, how are you providing economic development or nation building? How are you helping the youth? And I think about that, I was like, if that's the value of the community, that's how we should be measuring that educational success from a Quetzal perspective. And how would we root that back into Indigenous knowledge systems? Is that something we call Kwaname, or that warrior tradition, warrior spirit? And to me, I'm like, well, maybe giving back is actually Kwaname. And how would we measure that within research? And so to me, those are the exciting opportunities that we have when we're collecting our own data, is to examine those types of things, because we could see the same thing, all the limitations we see within the federal data. Dr. Ambo alluded to the erasure or invisibility of us in data and like not being brought to the table. And I get tired of that. And I'm tired of looking at the federal data and it being so inaccurate and inconsistent and irrelevant. And I'm like, why don't we just start collecting our own from our own perspective and start inserting our own values into what research is being put out there?
Thank you so much to our panelists for sharing your reflections on the questions that we've had this conversation about, that really explore the challenges and successes of related to mentorship. But more importantly, thank you for explaining why mentorship matters, as we guide the next generation of Indigenous scholars. You've given us a lot to think about. So at this time, I'd like to turn over the discussion over to Dr. Debbie Chadwick, who will share questions from the chat and other questions that have been submitted at the time of when people registered for the webinar. So we'll spend about 7 or 8, 10 minutes for a Q&A, and then we'll close up. Dr. Chadwick?
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Dr. Ben. I have a few questions here. So what I'm going to do is I'll read a question and then your choice of whom wants to start a discussion and answering it. Okay, our first question is, how do you provide mentorship to emerging leaders in institutions that may not see the need or benefit to growing their American Indian student enrollment? What can be done to continue this effort and sustain it long term? Everyone's smiling here.
I can answer. So how do you mentor? You know, the crude reality is that most institutions on this nation state don't have much value in terms of they walk the talk, they talk the talk, but they don't walk the walk, so to speak, in terms of echoing words of equity and inclusiveness and diversity. But then in the ground, you know, that enrollment numbers low, the support for the Native Student Center, if there's one as low, or cuts are always at the threat. So I share that kind of larger contextualization to recognize that we are doing that all the time, mentoring Native students in places where they are not, you know, a place that it's hard for them to thrive upon. And so what has helped me is just to be honest with them and have that reality within myself and them, and like, you know, we're doing this, like what we just all said today is we're doing this, like, what is your purpose? Why are you in this work? Reminding them that why they're there for the degree, being an advocate for them should there become any issues that they, you know, allowing them to share with us as there's stuff what we could do to support you. I mean, one of the things I value that Dr. Brayboy always asked me, like almost every time we met, was like, what could I do to support you? It was like a closing question he asked, and I really treasured that. I feel like those type of words and framing and questioning are really crucial in helping our students to see the brilliance that they have to offer, despite maybe what the institutions are saying or doing.
Anybody else? All right, I can go to the next question then. In this digital world, how do we connect with the youth as our future leaders in Native country that need more guidance to realize their potential?
I mean, I could speak to that a little bit. I know for me, it's a difficult thing because we've been trying to work on this project. So we have about 44,000 square acres, and about half of that is farmland. But we don't have any Quetzal farmers within our community. And it's problematic given that most of the land leases are the land is leased out to non-Indigenous farmers from the area. And so trying to take over those industries and to contribute to the economic development of our community, we've been trying to think of ways, and we're trying to reach out to the youth as far as just, you know, generating interest. So one of the projects that we've been working on is called the incubator, and it's basically trying to promote entrepreneurship within our tribal community, and trying to get students just interested in like, how can we develop economic development, or, you know, the economy within our community. We have a great former councilman named Willie White, who him and his brother started a billboard company, which is fairly non-invasive to the land. And I think of those types of things and what we could do within our community. I think that's where we start to generate more interest, and just being like, hey, you know, we have a need here. And for me, it really has to be birthed from the community in itself, though. And I think that's where I find help, and when trying to generate the youth ideas too, is just including them into those conversations.
Yeah, I don't have children, and I have a few nieces and nephews, and so this response comes from that context. I think that we need to ask students, like Jameson or Dr. Lopez said, we need to ask students, you know, what do they want, right? Our students, Indigenous people are brilliant. That's just a reality. I think I'm gonna refrain from what I was gonna say. And so I think that we should just ask students what they want to see, what creative ideas that they have. And the other thing that I would say is we need to start speaking a digital language. We need to start meeting our students where they're at. We need to, and you know, me as a person who has no social media, we need to be innovative and creative, equal to what our youth are. TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. They're building websites and Google sites, and I think that some of us are averse to it or are just learning how to do it. But I think that if we were to get to the level where our youth actually are, we could actually speak to them in a language or in a way or through a platform that really ignites their passion and their interest and really draws on their creativity and their innovation. Zines, that's what I hear the kids are talking about these days. No, I think that's like a few years old.
Thank you. Okay, another question. How does a scholar in academia build mentorships with other Indigenous scholars?
You know, I'd like to give a shout out to two wonderful students that I'm working with. They're both PhD students, Ray Begay and Nicole Begay. And they have been just modeling things that I didn't do when I was a grad student. And it's just been so beautiful. So I think what helps too is they're working together. And I think in many ways, working with someone else makes a difference. But they've been outreaching to Native scholars and setting up right now Zoom sessions. They met with Dr. Faircloth after getting inspired by the webinar that Dr. Faircloth was on, and said, hey, we'd love to talk with you. And so it's just been really amazing to see how they've outreached to folks to engage in conversation. In addition, prior to that, they're reading on their own because they're taking courses that are not reading work by like Faircloth or others, but they're engaging in dialogue on their own and have a reading group. So they're prepping themselves. So when they go to meet, like they're meeting. And so I'm learning a lot and hearing the way that they're working. And I think about myself and how I get shy in many ways of approaching somebody still, and they're giving me the courage to like reach out to folks. But I definitely feel like when we have the opportunity to have a relationship with someone, whether it's at a conference, over coffee, I think those are really important times of connecting with folks and then staying in contact with them and attending the sessions or learning or sharing. I feel like I value that when people approach me and they're interested in my work and want to learn more, and spending that time and doing that. You never know what's going to happen. I think that's the other thing. You never know that coffee 5 years ago is going to end up being a relationship years later. And sometimes it doesn't work out, but sometimes it does. Many times I think it does in many regards. And so it's valuing that relationship that we know. Mentorship is about building relationships. So it's building those relationships and having the courage to do that is something I'm still working on. But the students, like I mentioned, are giving me so much inspiration to do that as well.
And I wanted to add a little bit to that because, I learned so much from students as well, Amanda, and I'm learning practices from them that I would have not considered doing before. And so something that I would encourage students to do when they're trying to connect with other Indigenous ed scholars or Indigenous scholars, in addition to being prepared and doing reading, is, develop some talking points. The reality is, and I think we recognize this as we get further and further along in our careers, opportunities come up, we commit ourselves, we don't have the privilege or opportunity to say no to things as faculty. And so I have come to the realization that a lot of people who've mentored me and given me their time, they were very generous, and they actually didn't have the time to meet with me. And I actually should have showed up a lot more prepared to talk with them. And so something that I do now, like when I schedule a meeting with Dr. Brayboy, I send an agenda that's fully outlined of what I want to talk about, or to provide some broad updates so that he knows, and I do this with other mentors as well, so that they know where I'm at and specifically what I want to get out of the conversation. And it demonstrates a respect for that person's time. And it demonstrates some preparation and thought that went into the meeting. And sometimes an introductory meeting can just be that. But I think articulating to those people that you want to connect with, that what you want to connect on, it really has a good way of establishing a mentorship, establishing expectations, and really demonstrating a value that you put on your own time, but also their time.
Thank you, Dr. Ambo. We've ran out of time. There's more questions, so check your email. I'm sure there'll be people contacting you. So I'll now turn it back over to Dr. Ben for the closing.
Thank you, Dr. Chadwick, for asking the questions. So I also want to thank our audience for submitting your questions, which were really good. And we apologize if we didn't get a chance to ask your question to the panelists. But as we are starting to wrap up, I want to address the panelists and thank them for responding to the questions submitted by our audience. Over this past hour, we've really enjoyed your thoughtful responses to all of the questions, which really highlight stories of you navigating the academy and your ways of paying it forward to your students and to others. So this webinar conversation focused on the theme of mentoring the next leaders of Indian education. And I'd like to make a connection between the theme and our conversation for today to our online Masters of Arts in Indigenous Education. So as an assistant professor and the lead for the online Indigenous education program, I'm really grateful that I had the opportunity to mentor and work with students who are both emerging and current education leaders in our program. I really encourage our audience to learn more about the Indigenous education program by visiting the School of Social Transformation's website. And lastly, we posted the first 4 webinars that we've held in the past couple of months on the CIE website, and we'll be posting today's webinar on there for everyone to watch again. So I want to close by expressing my appreciation to our panelists for sharing your thoughts and knowledges with all of us in the audience. We look forward to seeing how your impact to Indigenous education develops in the years to come. So thank you so much. I now would like to invite Dr. Brian Brayboy back to conclude our webinar series with his closing remarks.
Hey, it's Brian Brayboy, and I just want to close up with a retrospective of what we've done over the last few webinars and meetings. Look, the center is unique unto itself. We are now 62 years old, even though we are celebrating our 60th anniversary with this. There isn't another center quite like us anywhere in the world, and we take seriously what we bring to this and really our goals to try to move some of this forward. Starting with the history of the center, which I think the initial panel really gave us, early leaders of the center really helping guide us through the future of Indian education. And that second panel is a really nice follow-up with that. So you've got some of the senior most leaders in Indigenous education helping us think about the past. And in part, what the past does for us is it really tells us a whole bunch about the future. The temporal aspects of this, the time aspects of this, become really important because in some ways, in order for us to have some sense about what the next 60 years is going to be like, we need to have some sense about where we are. If you think back about 1928, with what's now called the Merriam Report. And the recommendations were about making sure that Native children came to school well fed, that they had Native teachers, that they had language and culture in part of their curriculum, and that education should be local. If you fast forward 93 years later, we are calling for the same kinds of things. And so in some ways, the future for us is in the past, but ideally, we will begin to address those things from 1928 in 2021 and beyond, and be able to think about what the next steps are. This is fundamentally about how we center children and communities, which is what I think that those panels did for us. The third session really gave us a meet about people who are leading now. Everyone is leading now, but that group was really some of the folks who are helping guide us through. You have a senior vice president at the Spencer Foundation. You've got someone who has started a really great teacher ed program at the University of Arizona, and then you have a director of a school of education, all Native scholars, all with active writing agendas, all with different kinds of leadership opportunities. That's the now. And then the last session was really about folks who are helping guide us into the future, many of us, we are looking at and sort of saying, these are the people that should be guiding us. And then this panel today really gives us a real sense about where things are moving, and people who are writing currently in really powerful ways. As we begin to think about this work, they're helping us think about larger questions of belonging. And what does it mean to belong as a Native person in the 21st century? What will the next 60 years look like as they begin to help us think about and guide us through? What's the importance of land and land acknowledgements in the work that we are doing? And then who's going to guide and set those conversations moving forward? So part of what we've tried to do, what this team, this amazing team who has set up these webinars has done, is to say, let's think about the past, let's think about the now, and let's think about the future. Not disconnected from one another, but the ways in which they intersect and guide us. I am so thrilled and so proud of what everyone has brought to this, what our team has brought to this, the ways in which we're thinking about the past and into the future, and grateful for everyone's generosity. Most of all, I'm grateful for you being here and working through this and being with us as we do this. I will look forward to being in the audience as a past director of the Center for Indian Education as we celebrate 70 years. Take care. Thank you for all you do for Indigenous children and for communities. Thanks for being you, and thanks for being here. Take care.